Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into two of the biggest questions we all face. What is life? And what is death? We're going to walk through a single powerful lesson that offers a perspective that might just flip what you thought you knew on its head.
Wow, that's a pretty bold way to start, isn't it? The lesson we're exploring today doesn't pull any punches. It immediately confronts a belief that so many of us hold. It argues that death isn't some natural, expected part of the cycle. It's something else entirely, an enemy, the very opposite of life. So, to really get our heads around this, here's our learning route for today. We'll start by redefining life and death, then we'll look at a famous paradox from the Apostle Paul. After that, we'll zoom out to see an unseen spiritual war, which leads to a call for unity, and finally, we'll see how suffering fits in with this idea of an ultimate hope. All right, first things first. To really grasp this perspective, we kind of have to unlearn some of the common ideas we just assume are true about what happens when we die. So you can see here, we've laid out two totally different ways of looking at this. The common view, right, that death is just a natural end, it's part of the cycle of life, maybe an instant trip to heaven. But then, the lesson comes in with this completely different take. Death is an enemy that needs to be destroyed. It's the opposite of life. And this is key. It's a temporary, dreamless sleep. Okay, so this right here is the cornerstone of the whole idea. Death as a temporary sleep. The lesson points to texts like Ecclesiastes, which says, "The dead know nothing," and that story of Lazarus in the Gospel of John, where Jesus literally says that Lazarus is just sleeping. The main point is that consciousness stops. You're simply at rest, completely unaware, until a future event, the resurrection. This is a huge piece of the puzzle we're putting together today. Okay, so moving on. If death is just sleep, that brings us to a really famous and, honestly, a kind of confusing statement from the Apostle Paul. It really feels like a paradox when you think about it. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But you gotta ask, right? If death is just an unconscious sleep with no immediate reward, how on earth is that gain? It doesn't seem to add up. So let's see what the lesson says Paul really meant by this. Well, to get the gain part, we first have to understand how he saw life. For Paul, life was all about the mission. His one and only goal, whether he was free or in chains, was to honor Christ and build up the churches. And the lesson points out that this was a heavy, heavy load, filled with constant worry and persecution. And that highlights this really interesting idea, that living a life that truly resembles Jesus might actually lead to more struggle on earth, not less. And that brings us to the answer. According to the lesson's take on this, the gain Paul was talking about, it wasn't about zipping off to heaven the moment he died. It was about two things. First, if he died for his faith, his message, his witness would become even more powerful. And second, death was the necessary step to his ultimate hope, which wasn't an immediate reward, but attaining the resurrection from the dead. That future event was the real prize, the ultimate gain he was looking forward to. Death was just the quiet, resting step to get there. So we've been looking at the individual perspective on life and death. Now, the lesson asks us to pull the camera way, way back, to see the bigger context for everything, an unseen spiritual war. This huge conflict is called the Great Controversy in the lesson. And it's not a physical battle with, swords and shields. It's a war of ideas, of values, of loyalties. And it's the invisible backdrop for all of human history, and every single one of us is involved, whether we realize it or not. In this war of ideas, the lesson lays out the specific strategies. One side, which it attributes to Satan, uses these tools to divide and conquer. I mean, think about it. Criticism, betrayal, embarrassment, fear, peer pressure. They aren't physical weapons, but man, are they effective at tearing people and relationships apart. And in total contrast, the spiritual weapons for Christians are the ones that do the exact opposite. They build up. They unite. Love, mercy, peace, gentleness. The lesson is clear that these aren't just passive feelings. They are active tools in this spiritual conflict. The most powerful one mentioned is the Word of God. So if life is this big spiritual battle, and the main tactic of the opposition is to divide everyone, it makes perfect sense that the best countermove is unity. And that brings us to our fourth section. The lesson really zeroes in on this prayer from Jesus. And listen closely to the reason why he prays for unity, that the world may believe. So according to this view, believers getting along isn't just about having a nice, friendly church. It's supposed to be the most powerful, most convincing evidence to the entire world. So how do you actually do that? How does this unity happen? The lesson suggests it comes from living like citizens of heaven right here on earth. It connects this idea to a famous passage in Micah and breaks it down into 3 really practical things. Do what's right, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. These are like the actual bricks you use to build that unified community. And if those are the building blocks, what's the wrecking ball? The lesson is super clear on this one. It identifies the root causes of all the fighting and disunity as pride and worldly ambition. Basically, when me becomes more important than we, conflict is what you get. All right, this brings us to our last piece of the puzzle, and it's probably the toughest one: suffering. If there's this big spiritual war and a call for unity, where does all the pain and hardship we see and experience fit into the picture? Well, it comes right back to that divide and conquer strategy. The lesson points out that a house divided can't stand, right? So unity isn't just for showing the world something. It's also a source of incredible strength. A united group can become fearless in the face of opposition because they are standing together. Now, this can be a really hard concept to wrestle with, but the lesson emphasizes that suffering for your beliefs isn't presented as some strange accident. It's actually framed as an expected part of the Christian journey. The scriptures referenced here all point to this idea. The core concept is that suffering for a greater cause is seen as more meaningful than the alternative, just the random suffering that can happen to anyone. This quote from the lesson's resources really captures that ultimate mindset. I mean, even when facing the most extreme persecution, the focus isn't on the pain of the moment, but on a future shout of triumph. It's a perspective that is completely rooted in a hope that goes way beyond current suffering. So, let's bring it all home. What's the core message from this whole exploration? It's really a 3-part framework. Life is a spiritual battle, not of flesh and blood, but of ideas and values. Death is not the final chapter, but a temporary, unconscious rest. And unity, built on humility and service, is the source of strength we need to navigate that battle and hold on to a hopeful future. And that brings us to our final slide. We'll just leave you with this question to chew on. If you were to adopt this framework, that life is a spiritual battle and death is just a temporary sleep, how might that really change your priorities, your actions, and your sense of purpose from day to day? It's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us.